Hello, everyone watching on YouTube. I'm Emily Walker from the U.S.Embassy, Algiers, and welcome to Let's Chat, a show on American culture that's hosted by the American Cultural Center, Algiers. We have a really interesting show for today, but before we get to that, I'd like to say Mabruk to all the high school seniors who passed the back exam. I know you got your scores today because a few hours ago, I was sitting outside at my house here in Algiers when fireworks or gunshots, I'm not sure which, started going off and they haven't stopped. It's a total scene outside. Everyone's driving around and honking their horns. I assume from all this celebration that a lot of people passed. So again, congratulations. That is a huge, huge accomplishment. So, as you probably all know, Americans will soon elect a new president. Election day is Tuesday, November 3rd. I know a lot of you follow American politics, so you know that every presidential election in America can be kind of crazy. The debates, the attack ads, the scandals, it's a lot. But this is nothing new. There have been crazy, sometimes unbelievable stories from practically every presidential election we've ever had since the founding of our country in 1776. So today's guest is going to talk about that. I'm delighted to have as my guest Connor Powell, who has a podcast called Long Shots that is entirely devoted to this idea. Each episode is about a different long shot candidate who ran for president, someone who seemingly had no chance of winning, but whose very presence on the political stage signified something important about the time and mood of America. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Connor. He's a veteran TV correspondent. He started off at a TV station in Washington State. Then he moved to Afghanistan as a freelance video journalist. He covered Congress and the 2008 presidential election for TV stations in Washington, D.C. Then he returned to Afghanistan, where he was embedded with U.S. forces in his reporting for Fox News. He spent time in Libya covering the Arab Spring, and he's lived in Jerusalem, where he reported from Gaza and on Syria's civil war and the military coup in Egypt. He's currently a freelancer with CNN and based in Los Angeles, where he lives with his wife, the author and journalist Atiya Abawi, and their two kids. He's the host of the Long Shots podcast, which is what we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, Connor, I'd like to start by welcoming you and ask you, why did you want to start a podcast on long shot political candidates?
Emily, thank you so much for having me, and hello to everyone who's out there and watching on YouTube and who is based in Algeria, and congratulations on getting the exam results. I know that's a big deal, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of celebrations through the night. So long shots is an idea that our politics is often shaped by outsiders. Anyone who's taken a history course knows that the old saying that history is written by the winners. But what we found in doing the series is that in political history, it's often not the winners who write the history, but it's also the losers who helped shape our political history. We always think of politics as who is the Democratic nominee and who's the Republican nominee, and then who wins the general election. You know, is it George Bush? Is it Barack Obama? Is it Ronald Reagan? But before they win their nominations and before they win the presidential election, these candidates often have to go through a pretty difficult process to win their nomination, and then they face a lot of different competitors. So it's not just John McCain versus Barack Obama in 2008. They have to defeat a lot of other presidential hopefuls as well. And with long shots, we wanted to look at some of these outsider candidates, some of these political hopefuls who really had no chance of winning, but helped steer our debate. And some of the candidates that we looked at were people like Pat Buchanan, who ran in 1992 as a Republican against the sitting president, George Bush. And Buchanan didn't win, but he so beat up George Bush in the Republican primary that George Bush ended up losing that 92 election to Bill Clinton. So Pat Buchanan was a loser in the political sense. He didn't win, but he really helped shape that 92 election. There's other people like Victoria Woodhull, who was the first woman to run for president in 1872 before women even had the right to vote. And she had a chance.
Interject real quick, Connor, that this story that Connor's about to share is the one that stuck with me the most from your podcast. I cannot believe that a woman ran for president in the United States before women could even vote. Not even just before, like way before.
Almost 40 or 50 years before the women had the right to vote.
Yes. Okay. So tell us about this crazy story about Victoria Woodhull.
Right. So in the 19th century, the only people who were allowed to vote were white men, essentially, in the United States. And then after the American Civil War, there was a push for both Black men and women to have the right to vote. The US changed its constitution and allowed Black men to vote, but still not women to vote in the United States. And that was a huge point of contention and disagreement in America. Women who had helped move a public opinion against slavery thought that they should also have the right to vote, not just Black men who had been freed. And one of the women who had long argued this was a woman named Victoria Woodhull. And she's got this sort of crazy American biography where she grew up in poverty. She was the child of grew up in a huge family, and their parents basically had them working from a young age as clairvoyants, as mystics, as psychic readers. And they would go from town to town selling herbal remedies, telling people's fortunes. And just before they were about to get thrown out and arrested of this town, they would always flee and they'd always run. So from the very beginning, she was somebody who was charismatic, who was constantly selling herbal remedies and opinions and ideas. So her jump into politics later in life was pretty, I guess that's not unremarkable because a lot of people in politics are charismatic and are used to being in front of people. Well, she became a female suffragette, a women's activist later in life. And she really believed that women should have the right to vote. But women were not given the right to vote after the American Civil War. So she decided that she was going to run for the presidency. There's nothing in the Constitution that said that women can't run for the White House. Didn't say that they could, but it didn't say that they couldn't. So they decided, she and her supporters decided that she would be the first person who would run for the White House. And she ran essentially on a belief that women should have the right to marry who they choose. Women should have the right to divorce when they wanted to, and they should have control over their own finances. In the 19th century, in 1870, that is a pretty radical idea, in addition to being a woman who wants to run. But it's part of a long line of presidential candidates who thought, we have a voice and we should run, and we're going to use our voice in politics to help change the conversation in America. So she and her sister had launched this newspaper, and they used their newspaper to really push these issues in America. She ultimately was arrested 3 days before the election in 1872 and charged with essentially putting out obscene information. And she and her sister had written a series of articles about men doing really naughty things, having affairs, corruption, and things like that. And the sort of traditional male power structure in the United States decided that that was just too much, that they couldn't tolerate this. And so she was arrested. But she gave rise to, and she was part of this growing voice of women who said, we deserve a role in American politics, and we deserve a role in the sane and running of our country. She wasn't the first to do it, but she was the first woman to run for the presidency and to say publicly across the entire United States, campaigning in every town and every city, that women have a right to be a part of this election and have a right to be part of governing.
And how was she received by people, Connor? Did people take well to a woman running for president, or?
No, so she was ridiculed, and she was criticized, and they ran cartoons in newspapers calling her Mrs. Satan. And there's famous cartoons of her dressed as the devil, as Satan. So she was criticized. You know, the sort of belief was that she should be at home with taking care of her children. She shouldn't be out campaigning, but she didn't care. And there were a lot of other suffragettes at the same time, and who were pushing this message as well, is that women deserved a role in American politics. And ultimately, about 50 years later, women did get the right to vote legally. And we've had women running in Congress for the government and for the presidency, obviously in 2016. Hillary Clinton was the first Republican female nominee. But we've had women running for the presidency for, pretty often ever since, and both Republican and in the Democratic Party. But Woodhull is special because she basically said, I don't like this political system that we have in the United States. It excludes women. and I'm gonna run and give my voice to all the women who want to have a say in our political system. And then one of the beauties of the American political system is outsiders, long shots, people who don't really have a role in the formal government still have a right to run for the presidency. And Woodhull was one of the first ones to say, I'm going to do this, despite people saying I don't have the right. And she claimed that right.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Yeah, I think that is what your podcast really shows, is that, people can really make a splash on the political scene that maybe aren't in these pre-prescribed categories. For people watching on YouTube, feel free to ask Connor questions in the YouTube chat. You can ask him questions about election history in the US, or even, I'm sure he would be happy to take some questions about his career as a journalist. As I mentioned in the intro, he's been all over. He's covered wars. He's a very seasoned TV reporter. So you can ask him some journalism questions about his experiences too. So Connor, I'd like to ask you about another candidate who really was seen as an outsider at the time. I remember this candidate specifically because I was in third grade in my elementary school. This was in 1992. My elementary school had a mock election where students, everybody in elementary school, so little kids, could cast a ballot and vote. So I remember we were voting for George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, or Ross Perot. This is very unique in the US because there's really two candidates who people are talking about, a Democrat and a Republican. But there was Ross Perot's name on the ballot. So would you explain to us a little bit about Ross Perot and why this was interesting for US history?
Sure. So the US has always had, as you said, Democrats and Republicans on the ballot. Those are the traditional ones. But every so often, a third party candidate springs up and sort of galvanizes and grabs public opinion and runs on a couple issues that become really important to a percentage, just a medium-sized percentage of the country. And in 1992, the US was coming out of its success in the Iraq War and the Gulf War, perceived as success domestically in terms of defeating Saddam Hussein and pushing them out of Kuwait. And George Bush had an approval rating of 90% in America. I mean, that's just unheard of. That's almost, it doesn't seem real. But for a few months, the polls had him as probably the most popular president in American history. But the US economy was not doing well. And a few months later, the US election started to get underway, and H. Ross Perot, who was a successful American businessman from Texas, decided that he wanted to run for the White House because he did not like George H.W. Bush, and he didn't really like Bill Clinton either. And at that point, Bill Clinton hadn't won the Democratic nomination, but it was clear he was a contender. And Perot thought both the Democrats and the Republicans spent too much time attacking each other, too much time spending money in Congress, and not enough time solving problems. And as a businessman, he thought he was a problem solver. So he began his political campaign in February of 1992. And within a few months, by May of 1992, he was leading both the sitting president, George H.W. Bush, and the Democratic nominee, Bill Clinton. And this was a total shock to the American system because instead of campaigning negatively and saying bad things about his opponents and running campaign ads that were really vicious and nasty, that sometimes Democrats and Republicans both do, Perot would sit behind a desk in front of a bookshelf and have a little pointer and hold up these little whiteboards and just point at pie charts and graphs. And he would say, we're spending too much in America. We're not doing this and we're not doing that. And I'm going to fix this. And he was very folksy. He was very down to earth, but he was a billionaire. I mean, he was worth a lot of money, but he connected with a lot of Americans who thought that the government wasn't working for them, that the government was broken, the government needed to be fixed. And he ended up dropping out in the summer because as we talk about in the podcast, long shots, he didn't really want to be president. He just wanted to impact the conversation of the US election. He wanted to force George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton to talk about the debt that the US had, the deficit, the trade deficit, and then also the government spending. And those are the things that were really important to H. Ross Perot. And so he forced them to talk about this. He drops out with a bit of a scandal. He claimed that Republicans were trying to disrupt his daughter's wedding that summer. and that they were attacking him and his family. But he returned into the race later that month, or later that fall in October. And he really changed American politics forever, because for the first time, America starts talking about federal spending, how much the government spends and how much it spends on different programs, whether it's welfare reform or government deficit spending on trade, or even how much it was spending on defense wars and things like that. Perot had been in the U.S. Navy, had gone to the U.S. Naval Academy, but he was against the first Gulf War. He was against the war in 1991. And his attitude was, I don't know why we're fighting wars in the Middle East. Excuse me. I don't know why we're fighting wars in the Middle East. These people didn't attack us. We shouldn't fight them. And in large part, it was because as a businessman, he wasn't connected to oil and gas, whereas George H.W. Bush was an oil and gas man from Texas, had a very different worldview. And Perot really thought that the U.S. shouldn't be getting involved in wars around the world. We should just be doing trade and focusing on a good, non-corrupt government. He ended up losing. George H.W. Bush loses to Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton comes in and begins to adopt a lot of his policies. They do welfare reform, and they begin to sort of try to change the way government works in the United States. And so Perot is really important because he's an example of an American businessman, American outsider who came in and challenged the U.S. system. He was a long shot. He ended up losing, but it was sort of proof that these guys can come in and have a say about American politics, even if they're not Democrats or Republicans.
Thank you for that. We have a lot of questions coming in for you on YouTube, so maybe I'll give you some of these. A question just came in from Mehdi Belisel, who asks, do you ever, as a person that has political insight, think that the democratic process has flaws and should be fixed?
I think the one thing you'll find about America, if you spend most times with Americans, is that everybody thinks our process is flawed, and everybody thinks it needs to be fixed and changed. How you fix and change it is an argument that we've been having since America was founded. And I think there's nothing more American than criticizing your government. It's one of the things that we are really lucky, is that we get to criticize our government. Even your own party people will criticize. If you look at the fight that Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden and all the other Democratic nominee or presidential hopefuls had, it was all a fight about what needed to change in a government. Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee, believes a more traditional view of how the government should run. And Bernie Sanders, who's a Democrat as well, wants to see an expansion of healthcare. He wants to see an expansion of government spending. And so, yeah, you have these fights about what would make America better. And you have those fights on the Republican side, too. I mean, George H.W. Bush was the sitting president, and Pat Buchanan challenged him in 1992 and basically said, you're not protecting the little guy. You're not protecting the factory workers. You're spending too much time working on trade deals and launching wars around the world. You'll notice that there's this constant theme and fight in America about how much we spend and how much we are involved in world affairs and wars around the world. These are two things that on both the Democratic and Republican side are constant fights in American political history, and go to how do we change our government and how do we change our politics.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. The same viewer, Mehdi Belisel, made a comment that maybe you can address, which is a good point. He's pointing out that, we're here talking about the political outsiders who are long shots, who maybe had no chance of winning. And he says Trump won in 2016 because he was an outsider. So sometimes those long shots actually do come. I mean, do you have any insights from what you've learned from researching all this history, like what maybe was different with Donald Trump's run for president than some of these other long shots?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Trump was a long shot. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about Donald Trump is he likes to say that the first time he wanted to be president was in 2015, and that's when he launched his campaign. He actually ran for president in 2000. In 2000, he and Pat Buchanan both fought for the Reform Party nomination, which is the old Ross Perot party. So after Ross Perot ran for president in 1992 and in 1996, he had created a party called the Reform Party. And in 2000, 4 years later, Donald Trump and Pat Buchanan both competed for that nomination. Pat Buchanan won it. no longer a Republican, but now as a Reform Party candidate. And Donald Trump tried it as well. So Trump has been involved in wanting to be president for a long time. So he was an outsider, but he was also somebody who wanted to be president. It wasn't just something he decided a few years later. Ultimately, he ended up running as a Republican in 2016, because the easiest way to be president is to run as a Democrat or a Republican, because it's just an easier way to get the nomination. It's hard to get it's hard to be on the ballot as an outsider, as an independent. But Trump was very much an outsider because he didn't care about the Republican Party. He hadn't been a Republican activist. He had, in fact, donated a lot of money to Democratic causes. And he was an outsider, but he ran essentially as an outsider in the insider party, right? The Republican Party is one of the two insider parties, but he ran as an outsider, and he captured that party. I mean, the Republican Party today is very much his party. And you know, he very much has molded that party in his image. He seized on a couple topics that had long been issues, immigration, which had long been an important policy fight over what to do in the Republican Party. In fact, in 1992, Pat Buchanan was the first person to raise the issue of building a wall between the U.S. and Mexico, and limiting immigration from other countries as well. And both of those are ideas that Donald Trump in 2016 essentially grabbed and made it his own as a Republican.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting background. Thanks for that. We have a question from DZ Sante Health DZ on YouTube, who asks, why do you think the American people are so afraid of socialism? And how do you think that affected the Bernie Sanders campaign in the last election? And perhaps this would also be a good time to share a story that you feature on your podcast of the time that a socialist did run for president in the United States.
Yeah, so one of the most interesting people that I learned about doing this podcast was a man named Eugene Debs. At the beginning of the 20th century, the U.S. was going through a huge change in its economy, but also in its society. You had a lot of immigrants coming from Europe and from around the world, and the U.S. was industrializing. You had a lot of factories, you had the railroad boom, but what it left was a division between people getting very rich, who owned the capital, essentially, you know, the people who owned the businesses, and the workers who did the labor. And Eugene Debs is part of a tradition in America that fought for what they described then as socialist policies, things like a 40-hour work week, limiting and excluding children from the workforce, and also giving equal rights in terms of protections to Black and to women workers and to voters. So Debs was sort of the first American socialist, or at least the most prominent one. And he was a huge influence. He ran for president 5 times. The last time he actually ran for president was in 1920. And he actually ran for president from a prison cell. He had been arrested by Woodrow Wilson's administration in 1918 because he was against the first U.S. war, or the first World War I, and the U.S. involvement in World War I. And when Donald Trump was saying in his campaign rallies about lock her up to Hillary Clinton, I found out about Debs because he was a political candidate who had run for president 4 times. Had gotten more than 1 million votes several times. And he had been locked up by his political opponent in 1918, Woodrow Wilson. And he still ran for the presidency in 1920 and got more than 1 million votes, or nearly 1 million votes, which is a pretty incredible thing if you think about getting 1 million votes for anybody, but then doing it from a prison cell. But Debs really was the first American socialist, and a lot of the policies that are mainstream American policies now, like the 40-hour work week and the right to unionize, these were all things that were deemed socialist 100 years ago. Today, I think the word socialism really scares a lot of Americans because we connect it with communism. And for a lot of Americans, we all remember the fight between sort of the Western world and the communist world in the Soviet Union and America. But if you look at a lot of policies in the United States, there are things that could be described as socialized. Labor policies are certainly socialized. How we provide medical care to people government and to older Americans. These are socialized policies. So a lot of policies that scare some voters are also very encouraged and liked by a lot of them. The Affordable Health Care Act, known as Obamacare, its opponents like to describe it as socialized medicine, but it's actually very popular in the United States because a lot of people need healthcare, obviously. So you have this interesting dynamic in American politics where we really don't like, in terms of polling and the conversation, we don't like socialism, but we do like a lot of socialized policies. And in 2016, that was an issue that was really important to Bernie Sanders in terms of healthcare and regulating banks, helping workers. A lot of his policies were sort of rejected by the Democratic Party, but we've seen the last couple election cycles, particularly people like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, run on these policies, do really well. Elizabeth Warren, they've run on these policies and have done well. And increasingly, the fight in the United States this election isn't just about Donald Trump and Joe Biden, but it's about healthcare. And our healthcare system is beginning to look a lot more like Bernie Sanders would want it to look, socialized, than the free market capitalists would want it to look like. And so to answer your question, I think Americans are reluctant to embrace socialism because of the connotations and the connection to communism. But a lot of the policies are increasingly finding their way into both the Democratic and the Republican Party, particularly things like trade tariffs to protect workers, which is something Donald Trump has fought very hard for, and socialized medicine, which is something that the Democratic Party increasingly is fighting for.
Thanks for that. I'm sure you found that a lot in your research of a time that one word kind of became toxic and meant something like socialism in the US. Yes, it's not the most popular word. So thanks for your comments on that. We have a question from Marie Jones, who wants to know, can you explain the process of US elections? We don't even have time to get into that, Marie. It's very confusing. We actually did a recent YouTube a couple months ago. Maybe I'll put the link in where we were trying to explain the process of presidential elections. It's a lot of electoral college talk. It's a little boring. So basically, she wants to know why it takes so many days to know the final result. And I'd be curious to ask you, I mean, you were researching presidential elections from 100 years ago, 150 years ago. It must have taken a very long time to know the final result back then, pre-internet, pre-daily newspaper. So if your comments on that, why does it take so long to know the results?
Yeah, well, so some years it does, some years it doesn't. Obviously in 2000, between Bush and Gore was an election that took through Christmas, through the new year. And just a few weeks before the inauguration on the 20th of January. So some elections do take a long time. Others, we knew Bill Clinton was elected in 1992 that night. We knew Barack Obama was elected that night in 2008. Same with Ronald Reagan in 2000 or in 1980 and in 84. So sometimes it happens very quickly in terms of the final result. Now, the campaign process is very long because you essentially have two campaigns. You have the general election, which happens from sort of about May of the election year, so May of 2020 until November. But you also have the primary process, which is how the parties pick their candidates. And that can begin as much as 2 years before the election year. So people remember in 2015, Donald Trump declaring for the presidency. He didn't actually do it in 2016. He actually declared his decision to run for the presidency in the summer of 2015. When Barack Obama ran for the presidency, he declared his presidency, months before as well. Sometimes it's as early as October of the previous year, or November of the previous year, but sometimes they do it a year and a half before. So the process is long in terms of the parties pick their nominee, and then it is about 6 or so months for the country to vote to pick between those two candidates as well.
Yeah, so Marie, there have been some elections where we find out who the president is the following day. Elections are on a Tuesday and we find out on a Wednesday who, is that right? Elections are always on a Tuesday, right?
It's always I believe the first or second Tuesday.
First Tuesday of November.
First Tuesday of every November. Yeah. And sometimes we find out that night. I mean, there are, when Reagan was reelected in 1984, it was such a landslide that they declared him by 11 o'clock Eastern. It was over. One of the issues in 2000 was people were still voting in America when they started to declare Al Gore the presidency. And then they pulled back and they changed it and they said, okay, not yet. We're not going to declare it just yet. And that was a problem. So today in the US, they wait to make any declarations until everybody is done voting, because people voting in the East Coast, their voting times stop 3 hours before people voting on the West Coast in places like California. So now they wait to make any declarations until after all of the votes after all the polling stations have been closed. Mm-hmm. But I can tell you, I've covered elections in Turkey. I've covered elections in Afghanistan. I've covered elections in other countries in Egypt. Their elections can take months. In other countries, their elections can take months. Afghanistan is a country where they vote in paper ballots, and the ballots are brought often by donkey to remote areas, and they're brought home to the counting centers by donkey sometimes. And those things can take a long time. Same within Turkey. And so I think the main goal for any democracy is always to get the vote correct. We don't have to have the election results that night. I think it's always to get it right.
Mm-hmm. Do you know if election results took a very long time in the past, 100 years ago? Were people waiting for weeks or months?
Sometimes it would take weeks, but usually it would take a week or so. So the way that they do it is you count the vote at the local level, and then they telephone or send a courier to a state. Remember 100 years ago, a lot of people lived in cities. So if you won cities, you were probably going to win the presidency. We're a bigger country and more spread out now. We have a lot more people living. There were a lot of people who lived outside of cities 100 years ago, but you could count the votes much quicker in a city. But yeah, often, it would take 3 or 4 or 5 days. But sometimes it wouldn't, if you know who's going to win the big states, it's always much easier to figure out who's going to win. So if you win New York, or you win Florida, or you win Texas, or you win California, even 100 years ago, if you won the high population states quickly, you had a sense of who was going to win pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And that's not necessarily because there's more people in that states. It's because those people are assigned to electors who vote in the electoral college. But that can be all we say about the electoral college, because that's a really complicated topic. So we have a question that came in from DZ Santé Health DZ, who wants to know your thoughts on whether the Russians intervened in the last election. Did that really happen? And if so, how can the American government prevent it in this election? I know that's probably not your area of expertise, but I'd be interested. I mean, you can share your thoughts on that if you'd like, but I'd also be interested if there was ever, in past presidential elections throughout history, were there ever accusations of foreign governments interfering in our election process? Or is this solely something that could happen now because we're all on the internet?
So I don't have any firsthand knowledge or information. I can only say what the FBI reports and the Senate Intelligence Committee and the people who have reviewed this and the people who have knowledge of this, and they've all concluded that Russia not only did try to interfere in the 2016 election, but succeeded. But there's some important distinctions that need to be made. There's no evidence that outside influences impacted actual people's voting process. So no ballots were essentially tampered with. Nobody's made that accusation. But the accusation that the Congress, through the intelligence committees, and also through the Mueller report and other investigative bodies, have all concluded that Russia tried to manipulate social media to favor President Trump. That's something he's obviously not happy to hear, but that's something that multiple groups that have looked at it have concluded, including Republicans as well in his own party. But the important thing is that there's no accusation that they tampered with anyone's votes. And part of it is it's very hard to tamper with America's voting process in terms of filling out a ballot, dropping it into the box or on the computer, because it's all done locally. The federal government doesn't actually control the vote. The federal government has really no control over the election other than to say it's on the first Tuesday of November. And the states are the ones who all do it. And the votes are actually cast in the local level. And unlike a lot of other countries, our local governments are pretty independent for the most part of our state governments and also of the federal government. So there's obviously relationships and connections, but they are all very independent. So it's very hard to rig the voting process. This is something that we've had a lot of conversation in the US this election about rigged elections and rigged voting processes. But there's very little evidence that that's actually ever happened in this country, because it is so difficult to vote illegally. One person might be able to vote twice because they got an extra ballot or they go to the wrong station, but it's impossible to do it on a large scale effort in which would impact the entire US election.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for that. I'm curious, in your reporting, did you, with learning all these stories about past presidential elections, do you feel that nothing has changed and maybe we're repeating all the same mistakes? Or do you get the opposite sense and feel like, oh, things have changed in the US a lot?
So things have changed. I mean, obviously, Victoria Woodhull's story is interesting because she was the first and only woman to run for president for about 100 years. And now this election, we had multiple women, Amy Klobuchar, Kamala Harris. There were multiple women. Things have changed in the sense that you didn't have Black or African Americans running for president until 1972 with Shirley Chisholm, and then Jesse Jackson, and you've had other people who run for president. So things have changed. The conversations about the policies are the things that really haven't changed a whole lot. We are still fighting and have been fighting over about what is America, what should the American dream be, what's the best way to fulfill the American dream. We are still fighting over about the way the government should help or not help Americans. We are still fighting about the role of money in politics, whether it's, one of the things that Eugene Debs talked about a lot in the early 20th century was the role of businessmen and bankers in American politics. So these are all things that we've been fighting and discussing for a long time. But the politics has changed a lot. I don't think people, in the past, there were some references to race as an issue in politics that were less explicit. And some of the conversations we're having today about race are much more defined and much more explicit. So yeah, politics is changing, but it's also staying the same a lot as well. And that's a little bit of a cop out, but I think it's the truth about American politics, which is every 4 years we get to elect a new president, and every 2 years we get to elect a new Congress. And so a lot of it does stay the same.
Thanks for that. And I want to just touch on something you just said, that how we talk about race in elections is more explicit now. And I think you meant that as a good thing, because in the elections of the past, people, you have a story, I'm sure, about a racist who ran for US president and made it surprisingly far. But back then, if you were a presidential candidate talking about race, you said things in a coded way, kind of a wink, wink, so people might know what you're talking about. And now we're much more explicit. Candidates are more explicit when they talk about race. So, do you think this is a good thing? And why don't you share the story of the racist man who ran for president?
So George Wallace was a longtime presidential hopeful from Alabama. He'd been governor of Alabama, and he ran in 64, he ran in 68, he ran in 72. In 68, he actually ran as an independent candidate. He's another one like Ross Perot, who ran as an outsider. He actually got a lot of votes. He won electoral votes in 1968. And he sort of ran on a platform of white supremacy, of America was founded for whites and should be protecting whites. It was very explicit in the sense that everyone knew what he was talking about. But he also talked about things, and he didn't talk specifically just about white and Black people or people of color. And he sort of used coded language. It's both good and bad. It's probably good that he didn't take our language and conversation to a very raw conversation that we're having today about race, and that President Trump has focused so much of his campaign about, protecting white working class people. But it also wasn't really great for America. America's always had an issue with race, going back to the days of slavery. So it's both good and bad that we're having this conversation today. It's good that we are having this conversation. It's also probably bad that we are still having this conversation. That is something that we have been dealing with for years. And in fairness to Trump and in fairness to Biden and all the other political candidates this year, we're probably still going to be talking about race in a few years, maybe even a few decades. Hopefully, some of the issues we're confronting today will not be as big of an issue. But race is not going away in America, or probably in other countries as well. And this is one of the things that every democracy has to overcome some of these things.
Thanks for that. I think we have time for one last question. This is also from Mehdi Belisel. Keep those questions coming. Mehdi is just in the YouTube comments. He really knows a lot about American politics, I can tell. He wants to know, what do you think about the growing partisanship in both political parties? And what do you think is the solution for this issue? Not sure if you have a solution, but maybe share with us what you learned in producing your podcast. Were things always so partisan? Is this new?
Yes, they have always been partisan. Every candidate has always said this is the most important election in their lifetime. They will repeat it 4 years later when they run again, or 2 years later if they run again in Congress. It's not to say that they're wrong or right, but partisanship has always been an issue. The U.S. went to war in 1860 over the Southern Democratic belief that the Republican Northern presidential candidate, Abraham Lincoln, was going to tear apart the country. Woodrow Wilson locked up a political opponent in 1918 because he disagreed with him over the direction of a war. Partisanship has always been an issue. It has also always been a fight within parties as well. I think one of the things when people talk about partisanship, they always think of Democrats versus Republican. But, Pat Buchanan tells us a lot about partisanship within the Republican Party. And I interviewed his campaign manager, and who is also his sister. And she basically said, we liked George Bush as a person in 1992, but we disagreed with everything he believed. And they were both Republicans. And Bernie Sanders, I think, would say the same thing about Hillary Clinton. I liked her as a person, but as a candidate, I disagree with everything she believed. And so you've had partisanship between parties for a long time. You've also had partisanship between candidates within parties. What you don't have in the past that we do today is the stepping on some political norms, whether or not you use the White House as a campaign site, whether or not you use federal officials to campaign for the incumbent. These are all things that in the past we've not done. There has been an effort to keep the president separate from the government. And these are things that are not necessarily partisan, because we've not seen other candidates and other parties do this yet, but it could very well become the norm that both campaigns and both parties do this. But right now, the biggest issue right now is that you've had these sort of political norms that have been disregarded by the current president. Whether or not it stays that way, it's tough to know. But one in small defense, and I'll wrap this up here quickly because I know we need to go. COVID has changed a lot in America, and it's changed the way we've been able to hold campaign rallies. When people were really upset that the Trump administration used the White House as a backdrop for a political campaign, there were also precedent. Franklin Roosevelt did that as well, almost 60, 70 years ago. So you have two presidents, a Democrat and a Republican, who have both done it, different ways, but they've both done it. So, again, it's one of those things that we think things are different today, but America has a long political history, and a lot of things that are happening today happened in the past as well. And that's really what got me excited about Long Shots, was to talk about the things and the fights that we had in the past. We thought they were unique today, but a lot of these things are repeats of what we've had in the past.
Thanks. That makes me think of an expression we have in English: the more things change, the more things stay the same.
Definitely.
Thank you so much, Connor. It was a pleasure to talk to you. You guys should really check out his podcast. You can find it at longshotpodcast.com. We put the link in the YouTube chat. We'll also drop it in there again. Connor, if Algerians want to listen to your podcast, do you have an episode that you'd recommend they start with?
Yeah, I think the Ross Perot one is in a lot of ways, or the Pat Buchanan one, because they talk about the political system that we are dealing with today and a lot of the political events. That said, I think Victoria Woodhull is really fascinating if you like American history and you want to learn more. I think Jesse Jackson's 1984 campaign, which really helped create the modern Democratic Party and helped elect Barack Obama years later, not because Jesse Jackson was a Black candidate, but because of the changes he made to the Democratic Party's platform and to the Democratic Party's voting system. Without Jesse Jackson in '84, there is no Barack Obama in 2008. So I would say listen to all of them, but there are episodes like Ross Perot, Pat Buchanan, Jesse Jackson, and Victoria Woodhull that I think are particularly relevant to today's political climate.
Great. Okay, good suggestion. So again, longshotspodcast.com. You guys should check it out. You should also subscribe to our YouTube page so you don't miss talks like this. We do them on most Wednesdays. So thank you guys so much for listening. And thank you so much, Connor. I hope to have you as a visitor in Algeria someday.
I would love to. As soon as we can get back on planes and fly around the world, I would love to come visit. It sounds like a beautiful and wonderful country, and you've done nothing but spoken highly about it.
Yeah, it is a great place. Connor is my friend in real life, guys, too. So it's a real invitation. I hope you and your family will come here. Thank you so much for talking with us. Thanks for your time. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Thank you so much.